Victor Romano thought he had permanently buried his heart the night his lover vanished without a trace. For 5 long years, he ruled the city's underground with a brutal, absolute detachment that rivaled the biting sleet of an unforgiving Orlando December. But tonight, the universe revealed its twisted sense of humor. Glancing through the rain-streaked bulletproof glass of his armored SUV, the mob boss finally spots her. The only woman he ever loved is sitting on a rusted park bench, wrapping her full figure around 2 shivering toddlers as she frantically texts on a shattered phone for a bed at a homeless shelter. And those twins huddled against her chest, they share his exact piercing blue eyes. The windshield wipers of the Cadillac Escalade dragged back and forth with a rhythmic, heavy thud, fighting a losing battle against the freezing rain. Victor Romano sat in the back seat, nursing a tumbler of amber liquid that burned pleasantly down his throat. The leather interior smelled of expensive cedar, gun oil, and the faint coppery tang of the business meeting he had just concluded in a damp warehouse near the Navy Pier. At 34, Victor was the undisputed head of the Romano syndicate. His face was a mask of sharp angles, a slightly crooked nose from a long-forgotten street fight, and eyes so pale blue they looked like chipped ice. Beside him, his right-hand man, Declan Murphy, was tapping away on an encrypted tablet, organizing the fallout of the night's violent acquisitions. "Take the route through Lincoln Park, Tommy," Victor ordered the driver, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "I want to see if the O'Connor crew is cleared out of the south corner like they promised." "Yes, boss," Tommy murmured, taking a sharp left. The streets were desolate. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees. Anyone with a modicum of sense or a roof over their head was indoors. The streetlights flickered, casting long, sickly yellow shadows over the slush-covered sidewalks. Victor stared out the window, his mind detached, running through ledgers and supply lines, when his eyes snagged on a shape near the edge of the park. Under the dim glow of a broken halogen lamp, a lone figure sat on a rusted cast-iron bench. It was a woman. She was a large woman, her full, heavy figure bundled in a faded, oversized maroon wool coat. Even from a distance, Victor could see the thick, soft curves of her body huddled in on itself, trying to minimize the surface area exposed to the biting wind. But she wasn't just shielding herself. She was bent over 2 small, lumpy shapes tucked fiercely into her sides, engulfed beneath the massive flaps of her coat. Victor's heart, an organ he primarily utilized for pumping blood to his fists, suddenly seized in his chest. He knew that coat. He had bought that custom-tailored cashmere blend maroon coat 5 years ago at a boutique in Milan. He had bought it for a woman whose thick, soft thighs he used to worship, whose heavy, beautiful breasts he used to bury his face in when the weight of his criminal empire threatened to suffocate him. A woman who was unapologetically fat, radiant, and the only peace he had ever known. Chloe. "Stop the car," Victor commanded. Tommy hit the brakes so hard the heavy SUV fishtailed slightly on the black ice before coming to a jarring halt. Declan looked up, instantly dropping his tablet and reaching inside his suit jacket for his Glock. "Boss, we got a problem?" "Stay here," Victor said, his voice strangely hollow. The tumbler of scotch slipped from his grip, spilling onto the floor mats, but he didn't care. His gloved hand shoved the heavy door open, welcoming the brutal, freezing assault of the Orlando wind. He stepped onto the slushy pavement, his black overcoat whipping around his legs. Every step he took toward the park bench felt like wading through wet cement. His mind screamed at him that it was impossible. Chloe Henderson was gone. She had taken his money, cleared out their shared penthouse safe, and disappeared into the ether 5 years ago, leaving a note that simply read, "I can't do this anymore." He had torn the city apart looking for her. He had burned down rival clubs. He had put bullets in the knees of men he suspected of hiding her, but he had found nothing. Eventually, the grief had metastasized into a cold, black rage. Yet, as he closed the distance, the reality of the scene shattered his hardened shell. It was her. Her once radiant blonde hair was dull and plastered to her face by the sleet. The beautiful, soft roundness of her cheeks was raw, red, and chapped by the wind. She was staring down at a cracked smartphone, her bare, trembling fingers typing furiously, completely oblivious to the apex predator stalking toward her in the dark. And then, Victor saw them. Tucked beneath her arms, wrapped in cheap, scratchy fleece blankets, were two children, a boy and a girl. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They were shivering violently, their tiny faces pressed into the soft, warm expanse of Chloe's chest. The little boy shifted, opening his eyes to look at the approaching figure. Victor stopped dead in his tracks. The breath left his lungs in a white plume. The boy had his eyes, the exact, icy, unmistakable Romano blue. 12% battery. Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her fingers were so numb they felt like blocks of wood, but she forced them to keep moving over the shattered glass of her phone screen. 2. Sarah Jenkins, social worker. Sarah, please. The landlord locked us out. Mr. Abernathy changed the deadbolts while I was at the diner. I have the rent money for tomorrow, I swear, but we are in the park. The twins are freezing. Is there any bed left at St. Jude's? Please. She hit send and watched the little gray circle spin. Mommy, it hurts, Arthur whimpered, his small voice muffled against the thick wool of her coat. He tried to burrow deeper into her soft belly, seeking the core heat of her body. I know, my sweet brave boy. I know, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. She kissed the top of his icy head, wrapping her heavy arms tighter around him and his sister Lily. Just a few more minutes. Mommy's fixing it. Mommy always fixes it, right? Lily let out a ragged, wet cough that tore at Chloe's soul. 5 years. She had survived 5 years of running, hiding, and scraping by. She had left a life of velvet and champagne, of dangerous men and whispered threats to give her children a chance at a normal life. She had fled because Victor's father, the former Don, had visited her while Victor was in Vegas. He had placed a silenced pistol on her coffee table and told her that a fat civilian liability was not going to give birth to the heir of the Romano family. He told her she would disappear, or he would cut the babies out of her and bury her in the foundation of the new casino. So, she ran. She took the cash in the safe to survive the first year, moved to a terrible neighborhood on the outskirts of the city under a fake name, and worked grueling shifts at a greasy spoon diner. The stress, the lack of sleep, and the cheap processed food she could afford had only added to her weight. She was bigger now than when she was with Victor, her body soft and heavy, bearing the physical toll of extreme poverty and unyielding maternal sacrifice. She didn't hate her body. It had kept her babies warm. It had shielded them. But society despised it, and her landlord, a slimy man named Paul Abernathy, constantly mocked her for it before illegally evicting her tonight. Message not delivered. The red exclamation point on her screen was a death sentence. 10% battery. Tears, hot and fast, spilled over her frozen cheeks. God, please, she begged the empty sky. Not them. Do whatever you want to me, but don't let my babies freeze. A shadow fell over her. Chloe gasped, instinctively tightening her grip on the twins and curling her large body over them like a protective shell. She expected a mugger, a drunk, or worse. She slowly raised her head, blinking through the freezing rain. Standing before her was a ghost. He was dressed in a bespoke black overcoat, the collar turned up against the wind. His broad shoulders blocked out the street lamp. The darkness of the night seemed to bend around him, subservient to his presence. But it was his face that made Chloe's blood run colder than the Orlando air. Victor. He looked older, harder. The faint lines around his mouth were carved deeper, and the cruelty in his eyes was palpable. He stood there, perfectly still, a predator calculating the fatal strike. Victor? The name tumbled from her cracked lips, barely a whisper. For a terrifying second, he said nothing. He just stared. His eyes tracked over her wet, unwashed hair, the dark circles under her eyes, her chapped lips, and the heavy bulk of her frame shivering on the metal bench. Then, his gaze slowly lowered to the two small faces peering out from her coat. Lily looked up at the terrifyingly tall man. Arthur just stared, his blue eyes mirroring the man's exactly. 5 years. Victor's voice was barely louder than the wind, but it carried a lethal, vibrating menace that shook Chloe to her core. I spent 5 years wondering if the woman who gutted me was dead, or just a whore who found a richer mark. Victor, please, Chloe pleaded, her voice shaking violently. You don't understand. I can't. I can't do this right now. They're freezing. My babies are freezing. Victor stepped closer. The smell of expensive scotch and his signature Tom Ford cologne hit her, a dizzying wave of nostalgia and terror. Your babies? He asked softly, crouching down so he was eye level with her. He reached out a gloved hand. Chloe flinched, pulling back. His jaw locked. Slowly, deliberately, he bypassed her and brushed his leather-clad thumb over Arthur's freezing cheek. The little boy didn't pull away. He just shivered. Look at me, Chloe, Victor commanded. She met his gaze, her chest heaving, the fabric of her coat straining across her bust. Did you really think, Victor whispered, his voice dripping with a terrifying, obsessive darkness, that you could steal my blood and hide them in the gutter? I didn't steal them, Chloe cried out, her maternal instincts momentarily overriding her fear. I was protecting them, from your world, from your family. My family? Victor barked a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the brick walls of the nearby alley. I am the family now, Chloe. My father is dead. He's been dead for 3 years, buried in a closed casket. Did you really think I wouldn't protect what was mine? Chloe froze. The old Don was dead. The man who had threatened to butcher her was gone. A wave of dizzying relief, instantly followed by crushing guilt, washed over her. She had been running from a ghost for 3 years, subjecting her children to squalor and freezing temperatures for nothing. Before she could process the revelation, Victor stood up to his full, imposing height. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand the full story. He simply took control. Get up, he ordered. Chloe hesitated, her legs numb. Victor, what are you doing? I said get up, he growled, reaching down and gripping her upper arm. His grip was firm, surprisingly careful not to bruise her soft flesh, but unyielding. He hauled her to her feet. The sudden movement made her sway, her heavy body clumsy from the cold, and she stumbled forward. Victor caught her. For a split second, her large, soft breasts were pressed against his rock-hard chest, and his hands instinctively spanned her thick waist. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. Despite the dirt, the cold, and the betrayal, the intense, volatile chemistry that had once consumed them flared to life instantly. Victor's breath hitched, and his grip tightened on her waist before he violently shoved the feeling down. Grab the girl, Victor said, his voice ragged. Without waiting for permission, he reached down and scooped Arthur up in his arms. The little boy gasped, but Victor immediately opened his large wool overcoat and tucked the child inside against his warm suit jacket. Mommy, Arthur cried out, frightened by the sudden separation. It's okay, Artie, Chloe sobbed, struggling to pick up Lily. Her arms were so tired and her back ached under the weight, but the adrenaline fueled her. Mommy's right here. Victor turned and marched toward the idling black SUV. Declan, he roared over the wind. The passenger door flew open, and Declan stepped out, his hand near his weapon. When he saw what his boss was carrying, the hardened mobster's jaw actually dropped. Open the back door! Turn the heat up to maximum! Now! Victor barked. Declan scrambled to obey, pulling the heavy rear door open. Warm air blasted out onto the street. Victor deposited Arthur onto the plush leather seat, then turned and practically shoved Chloe and Lily in beside him. Chloe collapsed into the rich, soft leather, pulling Arthur back into her arms. The sudden rush of hot air against her frozen skin felt like pins and needles. The doors slammed shut, enclosing them in a silent, warm vault, completely cutting off the howling storm outside. Victor slid into the seat opposite them. The spacious cabin of the Escalade allowed him to stretch his long legs, but the space felt suffocatingly small. He stared at the three of them. Chloe, looking like a drowned rat, her massive coat soaked through, clutching 2 carbon copies of him. Drive, Tommy, Victor said, hitting the intercom button. Take us to the estate. The estate, boss? The secure compound? Tommy asked, surprise evident in his voice. Did I stutter? Victor snapped. The SUV accelerated smoothly. Inside the cabin, the silence was deafening, save for the ragged breathing of the children. Chloe kept her eyes glued to the floor mats, her cheeks burning with shame. She knew how she looked. She knew how far she had fallen from the glamorous, polished woman Victor used to parade around. She was fat, destitute, and broken. Take off the coat, Victor suddenly said. Chloe looked up, defensive. No, I'm cold. The coat is wet, Chloe. You're keeping the cold against them. Take it off. She knew he was right. Trembling, she unbuttoned the soaked wool and shrugged it off her wide shoulders. Underneath, she was wearing a cheap faded gray sweatshirt that clung tightly to her heavy breasts and a pair of worn-out black leggings that stretched over her thick thighs. Victor's eyes tracked every movement. He didn't look at her with disgust, as her landlord did, or with pity, as the social workers did. He looked at her with a ravenous, furious hunger that terrified her even more. He leaned forward, pulling a heavy cashmere blanket from a compartment, and tossed it over her lap, covering her and the twins. "What are their names?" he asked, his voice softer now, but still carrying a dangerous edge. "Arthur," she whispered, "and Lily." "Ah, Arthur," Victor repeated, tasting the name. He looked at the little boy, who was staring back at him with wide, frightened eyes. "My grandfather's name." I wanted them to have something of you," Chloe admitted, a tear escaping her eye and rolling down her round cheek. In case they never met you." Victor's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle ticked in his cheek. He reached across the space between them. Chloe flinched, but his hand bypassed her face and gently wiped the tear away with the pad of his thumb. His leather glove was rough against her soft skin. "You have a lot of explaining to do, Mia Bella," Victor whispered, using the pet name he hadn't spoken in half a decade. "You robbed me of 5 years. You robbed me of watching my children learn to walk. I'm going to find out every detail of what happened. And if I find out you suffered because of someone, I'm going to paint the streets of Orlando red with their blood." Chloe shuddered, pulling the twins closer. The dark romance, the terrifying safety of Victor Romano, was wrapping around her once again, and she wasn't sure if she was being saved or simply trading the freezing street for a gilded cage. The Romano estate in Lake Forest was not just a home. It was a heavily fortified citadel, masquerading as a sprawling Gilded Age mansion. As the escalade passed through the towering wrought iron gates, flanked by armed guards disguised in heavy winter parkas, Chloe felt the last threads of her independence snapping. For 5 years, she had been a ghost, moving through the gritty, invisible underbelly of Orlando. Now, she was being dragged back into the glaring, dangerous light of Victor's empire. The SUV glided to a halt beneath a massive stone portico. Before Tommy could even put the vehicle in park, the heavy mahogany front doors swung open. A team of staff, perfectly manicured and silent, spilled out onto the heated driveway. "Take the children to the East Wing," Victor ordered as he stepped out into the freezing night, his voice cutting through the wind. "Wake Rosa. Tell her to prepare the nursery. And call Dr. Reed. I want him here in 10 minutes, or I'll drag him out of his bed by his throat." Chloe scrambled out of the car, clutching the cashmere blanket tightly around her thick waist. Her legs felt like jelly, the sudden shift from freezing street to heated car back to the biting cold leaving her disoriented. "Wait, no, they stay with me," she protested, her voice raspy. Victor turned, his imposing frame blocking her path. The courtyard lights caught the sharp, predatory angles of his face. "They need a hot bath, proper food, and a medical evaluation, Chloe. They are shivering. You are shivering. Let my people do their jobs." "They don't know your people," she fired back, a spark of her old fire returning. She stepped up to him, her heavy chest heaving under the damp sweatshirt. "They only know me." Victor stared down at her. He saw the fierce maternal terror in her eyes, the way her soft, wide body physically shielded the space where her children had just been. A muscle feathered in his jaw. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into the back seat and carefully lifted Lily into his left arm, then Arthur into his right. The twins, exhausted and bewildered by the sudden warmth and the terrifyingly large man, simply buried their faces in the lapels of his bespoke overcoat. "Then you will walk with me," Victor said softly. He turned and strode into the mansion, carrying 60 pounds of sleeping children as if they weighed nothing. Chloe followed, her worn, scuffed sneakers squeaking against the imported Carrara marble floors. The grandeur of the foyer was suffocating. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the sweeping double staircase. It was a stark, violent contrast to the roach-infested, drafty apartment on South Halsted Street. She had been illegally evicted from hours ago. As she caught a glimpse of herself in a massive gilded mirror, shame burned hot in her throat. She looked enormous and broken. Her blonde hair was a tangled, wet rat's nest. The cheap gray sweatshirt clung to the heavy, drooping weight of her large breasts, and her black leggings strained across her wide hips and thick thighs. She was easily 250 pounds, carrying the physical evidence of cheap high-calorie survival food and crippling stress. Beside Victor, who looked like a dark, lethal god carved from marble and wearing a $5,000 suit, she felt like a monster. They reached the master suite on the second floor. Victor gently placed the children on the center of a massive king-sized bed adorned with silk sheets. Rosa, a stern but kind-faced housekeeper who had known Chloe before her disappearance, rushed in with an armful of thick, heated towels. Rosa gasped upon seeing Chloe, crossing herself quickly before hurrying over to wrap a towel around the trembling woman's wide shoulders. "Signora Chloe," Rosa whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Praise the saints." "Draw a bath, Rosa," Victor commanded, his eyes never leaving Chloe. "The hottest you can make it without burning her, and bring the pediatric supplies." 10 minutes later, Dr. William Reed, the syndicate's private physician, rushed into the room, his medical bag clutched in his hand. He was a discreet man who had patched up countless bullet wounds, but the sight of the boss's secret children gave him pause. "Check them," Victor said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Every inch." Chloe sat rigidly on the edge of a velvet armchair, her heavy thighs pressed tightly together, watching like a hawk as Dr. Reed examined Arthur and Lily. "They have mild hypothermia," Dr. Reed diagnosed in a hushed professional tone. "Slight malnourishment. The little girl has a bronchial rattle, likely a developing upper respiratory infection from the damp conditions. I'll prescribe a course of antibiotics and a specialized high-calorie pediatric diet. They need warmth, rest, and fluids. Nothing permanent, Mr. Romano, but they were very, very close." Victor's hands curled into fists at his sides. The leather of his gloves groaned under the pressure. Very, very close. "Get out," Victor said quietly. Dr. Reed didn't hesitate. He packed his bag and vanished. Rosa, having finished wiping down the children with warm cloths and dressing them in oversized soft t-shirts she had found, bowed her head and backed out of the room, closing the heavy oak doors with a soft click. Silence descended on the master suite, save for the rhythmic, exhausted breathing of the twins, finally asleep in the center of the massive bed. Victor turned slowly to face Chloe. The predatory stillness had returned to him. "The landlord," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Give me his name." Chloe gripped the edges of the heated towel, pulling it tighter around her bulky frame. She refused to meet his eyes, staring instead at the intricate Persian rug beneath her worn shoes. "It doesn't matter, Victor. We're here now. I just need to figure out what happens next. What happens next is that you and my children will never leave this compound without a security detail," Victor stated, stepping closer. The scent of his cedar and bergamot cologne enveloped her. "What happens next is that you will never know the feeling of cold or hunger again. But first, you will give me the name of the man who put my blood on the street in a snowstorm." "He's just a miserable slumlord," Chloe argued, her voice trembling. "Paul Abernathy. He owns the building on Halstead. He changed the locks because I was a day late on the rent, even though I had the cash from my diner shift in my pocket. He hated me anyway. He called me a fat, lazy pig every time he saw me. He enjoyed throwing us out." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victor stopped moving. The utter, chilling silence emanating from him was far more terrifying than a scream. "Abernathy," Victor repeated. It wasn't a question, it was a death sentence. He took another step, closing the distance between them until the toes of his polished Oxfords touched her sneakers. "Stand up, Chloe." She shook her head, tears of exhaustion and humiliation finally breaking free. "Please, Victor, don't look at me. I'm disgusting. I'm not the woman you remember. I'm tired, I'm huge, and I'm broken. Just let me sleep. Stand. Up." The command was soft but laced with an absolute authority she couldn't fight. Trembling, Chloe pushed her heavy body up from the velvet chair. She stood before him, her shoulders slumped, trying to make herself as small as possible, a futile effort for a woman of her size. Victor reached out, his large hands grasping the edges of the towel she was clutching. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled it away from her, letting it drop to the floor. Then, his hands moved to the hem of her damp, cheap sweatshirt. "Victor, no," she whimpered, trying to cross her arms over her large chest. "Let me see you," he murmured, his voice suddenly thick with an emotion she hadn't heard in 5 years. Reverence. He gently pried her arms away and pulled the sweatshirt over her head, tossing it aside. She stood before him in a frayed, ill-fitting bra that dug deep into the soft, heavy flesh of her back and shoulders. Her stomach, which had borne the twins, was soft, round, and marked with deep silvery stretch marks. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the disgust, waiting for the mafia prince to realize the reality of what poverty had done to his prize. Instead, she felt the warm, calloused palms of his hands cup the heavy curves of her waist. He dropped to his knees in front of her. Chloe's breath hitched in a loud gasp. Victor Romano, the ruthless head of the Orlando Syndicate, a man who bowed to no one, was kneeling on the floor. He pressed his face into the soft, yielding flesh of her large stomach. He wrapped his arms around her thick waist, holding her with a desperate, crushing grip. "You are not broken," he whispered against her skin, his breath sending shivers up her spine. "You are a queen who fought a war in the dark to protect my heirs. You carried my world in this body, Chloe. Every mark, every ounce. I worship it, because it means you survived." He kissed her stomach, right over the silver lines that mapped her pregnancy. Then he stood, his icy blue eyes blazing with a dark, obsessive fire. He cupped her soft, round cheeks in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "My father is rotting in hell," Victor said, his voice vibrating with absolute certainty. "He died choking on his own blood from a stroke, and I didn't lift a finger to call an ambulance. I suspected he drove you away, but I could never prove it. If I had known he threatened your life, I would have put the bullet in his head myself." Chloe sobbed, leaning her heavy weight into his chest. His arms banded around her wide back, holding her securely against his rock-hard frame. The contrast between them was extreme, his hard angles and violent strength enveloping her soft, heavy curves. But it felt right. It felt like the safety she'd been craving for half a decade. "Go to the bathroom," Victor murmured, kissing the top of her damp head. "Rosa has filled the tub. Use the expensive oils, the La Mer creams on the counter. Wash the street off you. When you are done, my bed is waiting. No one will ever hurt you again." "Where are you going?" she asked, a sudden spike of panic hitting her as he stepped back. Victor's face went perfectly blank, a terrifying mask of pure sociopathy that he reserved strictly for business. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit. "I have some real estate to acquire," he said smoothly. "Sleep, Mia Bella." The basement of the Romano compound was soundproofed not for music, but for discretion. It smelled of bleach and damp concrete. Paul Abernathy was a rat-faced man in his late 50s, currently shivering in his silk pajamas, strapped tightly to a heavy steel chair in the center of the room. A single, blinding halogen bulb hung above him. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye, courtesy of Declan Murphy's pistol whip when they dragged him out of his Gold Coast condo 20 minutes earlier. The heavy metal door groaned open. Victor walked in, having changed into a simple black button-down shirt and dark slacks. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing thick forearms corded with muscle and black ink. "Mr. Romano," Abernathy squeaked, straining against the zip ties cutting into his wrists. "I don't understand. I pay my tribute. I pay the protection money for the Belmont Avenue properties on time every month. Ask your capos. I'm a loyal earner." Victor didn't say a word. He walked to a metal table in the corner and picked up a heavy steel-toed boot. He walked back to Abernathy and with casual, terrifying precision, swung the boot directly into Abernathy's left kneecap. The sickening crunch of shattering bone was instantly followed by an ear-piercing scream that tore from the landlord's throat. Abernathy thrashed wildly, sobbing in agony. Victor tossed the boot aside and grabbed a fistful of Abernathy's thinning hair, yanking his head back to look into his icy blue eyes. "You evicted a woman and 2 children tonight from your property on South Halstead," Victor said, his voice conversational, completely devoid of empathy. "A woman you called a fat, lazy pig. You put them on the street in a freezing rainstorm." Abernathy's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as the realization hit him. The Henderson woman? Oh, God, Mr. Romano, I didn't know. I swear on my mother's grave, I didn't know she was yours. She had no money. She looked like a nobody. "She is my wife," Victor lied smoothly, elevating Chloe's status in the underworld instantly. "And those children are my blood. You locked my blood out in the snow." "Please!" Abernathy shrieked. "I'll give it back. I'll give her the penthouse, rent-free forever." You don't have a penthouse anymore, Paul, Victor said, releasing his hair. He snapped his fingers. Declan stepped out of the shadows, carrying a leather briefcase. He opened it and placed a stack of legal documents and a Mont Blanc pen on a small rolling tray in front of the landlord. These are transfer deeds for Abernathy Holdings, Declan explained in a deadpan Irish brogue. Every property you own, including your personal residence, your bank accounts, and your 401k, is being transferred to a blind trust handled by Thomas Sterling over at Sterling and Blacklaw. You are going to sign them. I can't. That's everything. I'll be ruined, Abernathy sobbed. Victor leaned in, pressing a razor-sharp combat knife against the uninjured right knee of the weeping man. You are already ruined, Paul. The only negotiation happening right now is whether you leave this room in a wheelchair or in a series of very small garbage bags dumped in the Orlando River. Sign the papers. Shaking violently, Abernathy took the pen and scribbled his bloody signature across every page. When he was done, he slumped forward, broken. Take him to the edge of the city limits, Victor told Declan, wiping the blade of his knife on Abernathy's silk pajama shirt. Take his coat and his shoes. Let him walk back in the snow. If he survives the night, tell him if I ever see his face in Orlando again, I will peel his skin off while he watches. Yes, boss. As Declan began cutting the zip ties, Victor's encrypted phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped out of the basement and into the hallway to answer. Speak, Victor commanded. Boss, it's Tommy. His driver's voice crackled over the line. I've been going through the old security server logs from 5 years ago, like you asked, trying to see how the old Don tracked down Chloe's original alias before she ran. And? The Don didn't find her, boss. The old man didn't know how to use a computer, remember? He outsourced it. I tracked the payment from the family's off-book accounts. It went to Onyx Investigations. Victor's eyes narrowed. Onyx? That's high level. Who authorized the payment? There was a heavy pause on the line. Boss, the authorization signature on the wire transfer wasn't your father's. It was Uncle Dominic. The air in Victor's lungs turned to ash. Dominic Romano, his father's brother. The man who had mentored Victor, the man who stood as his most trusted advisor and underboss right now. Dominic had been the one to hunt Chloe down and feed her location to the Don. Dominic had orchestrated the threat. Victor ended the call, his grip on the phone so tight the screen cracked. He had his family back. He had destroyed the man who made them freeze tonight. But the real enemy, the man who had stolen 5 years of his life and forced the woman he loved into a living nightmare, was sitting at his own dinner table. The dark halls of the Romano estate felt entirely different as Victor walked back upstairs. It wasn't just a fortress anymore. It was a war room, and the streets of Orlando were about to run very, very red. The grandfather clock in the cavernous hallway of the Romano estate chimed 4 a.m. The storm outside had escalated into a full-blown Orlando blizzard, burying the sprawling Lake Forest compound in 2 feet of pristine, blinding white snow. But inside the mahogany-paneled library, the atmosphere was suffocatingly hot, thick with the scent of imported Cuban cigars and aged cognac. Dominic Romano sat in a winged leather armchair by the roaring fireplace. At 62, he was a silver-haired, impeccably tailored ghost of the former Don. He wore a velvet smoking jacket, his eyes closed as he listened to a vinyl record of Vivaldi playing softly in the corner. He looked like a man perfectly at peace with his wealth and his power. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. The sound was soft, but Dominic's eyes snapped open instantly. Victor stood by the door. He hadn't changed out of his black button-down shirt, and the faint coppery smell of Paul Abernathy's blood still clung to his cuffs. He walked slowly toward the antique globe bar cart, the silence stretching taut between the two men. "Victor?" Dominic rumbled, his voice smooth and paternal. "Declan texted me that there was a situation in the city." "A landlord? Why are you handling street-level garbage at 4 in the morning? That's what capos are for." Victor didn't answer immediately. He picked up a crystal decanter of Louis XIII cognac, poured 2 generous measures into snifters, and walked over to the fireplace. He handed one to his uncle. "The situation required a delicate touch," Victor said softly, his pale blue eyes reflecting the dancing orange flames of the hearth. "The landlord evicted a woman and 2 children, threw them out into the sleet. Dominic scoffed, taking a sip of the cognac. A tragedy of the lower classes, but hardly syndicate business. You're the head of the family now, Victor. You need to elevate your focus. The woman was Chloe Henderson, Victor stated, his voice dropping to a deadly hollow octave. And the children are my 4-year-old twins, a boy and a girl. The crystal snifter in Dominic's hand jolted. It was a microscopic movement, a fractional tremor, but to a predator like Victor, it was as loud as a gunshot. A drop of amber liquid spilled onto Dominic's velvet jacket. "Chloe," Dominic managed to say, perfectly feigning shock. "Praise the saints! She's alive? And you have heirs? Victor, this is incredible news. Where are they? We must fortify the compound. Bring them into the fold immediately." "They are sleeping upstairs," Victor said, taking a slow sip of his own drink. "Safe, warm. But before I went up to them, I had Tommy run a diagnostic on the old security servers. I wanted to see how my father found her alias 5 years ago, how he tracked her down to threaten her life." The Vivaldi record scratched slightly as it hit a dust groove. The sound grated against the tense silence. "Your father was a paranoid man," Dominic said carefully, setting his glass on the side table. "He saw her as a civilian liability, a soft, vulnerable target who didn't fit the mold of a mafia wife. It's a tragedy he drove her away, but he was acting in what he believed was the best interest of the Romano bloodline. That's the narrative I believed for half a decade," Victor agreed, stepping closer to his uncle's chair. "But my father didn't track her down. The payment to Onyx Investigations, the firm that located her fake ID and her new apartment in Pilsen, didn't come from my father. It came from an off-book account, an account only you had the cryptographic keys for, Uncle Dominic." Dominic froze. The mask of the paternal advisor cracked, revealing the cornered, calculating rat beneath. "Victor, you are exhausted. You are emotional. You're misinterpreting financial anomalies." "Do not insult my intelligence!" Victor roared, the sudden explosion of violence making Dominic flinch back into the leather chair. Victor slammed his cognac glass down on the mantelpiece, shattering the crystal. "You hunted her. You used my father's signet ring to stamp the order, making her believe the Don wanted her dead. You put the gun on her table while I was in Vegas negotiating the casino deal." Dominic stared at his nephew, realizing the lie was dead. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, toxic and fatal. Slowly, the older man's posture shifted. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, arrogant sneer. "She was a fat, pathetic liability, Victor," Dominic spat, the venom finally leaking out. "She wasn't a Roman. She wasn't a Baron. She was a waitress you got obsessed with because she let you bury your face in her tits and cry about the pressure of the crown. She was making you soft." Victor's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around Dominic's throat with the force of a hydraulic press. He hoisted his uncle out of the chair, slamming him against the stone masonry of the fireplace. Dominic choked, his hands scrabbling uselessly at Victor's iron grip. "Why?" Victor whispered, his face inches from Dominic's purpling visage. "You didn't care who I fucked. You didn't care who I loved. You only cared about the money. What did she do?" She saw," Dominic gasped, his eyes bulging. "The safe, the penthouse safe." Realization hit Victor like a physical blow. 5 years ago, Chloe had been organizing the paperwork in their private safe. "The Cayman Island ledgers," Victor breathed. "You were skimming off the union accounts, stealing from my father. She saw the flash drives. She didn't even know what they were, but you panicked. You thought she would mention the offshore accounts to me, so you terrorized her. You threatened to butcher her and my unborn children just to cover up your embezzlement. I built this family," Dominic wheezed, spit flying from his lips. "I deserved my cut." Victor's eyes went completely dead. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt absolute, terrifying clarity. He released his grip just enough for Dominic to drag in a ragged breath, then shoved him back down into the armchair. "You built nothing," Victor said smoothly, fixing his cuffs. "You are a parasite, and in the Romano family we amputate infected limbs." Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver pillbox. He opened it, extracted a single white capsule, and dropped it into Dominic's half-full glass of cognac. The pill dissolved instantly, fizzing slightly before disappearing into the amber liquid. Aconite, wolfsbane, undetectable in a standard autopsy, mimicking a massive sudden myocardial infarction. "Drink," Victor commanded. Dominic stared at the glass in sheer horror. Victor, please. I'm your blood. I'm your uncle. We can make a deal. I have 30 million in those accounts. I'll transfer it all to you. Just exile me. Send me to Sicily. Please. Victor drew his Kimber 1911 pistol and pressed the cold steel barrel directly against Dominic's forehead. You have 10 seconds. Either you drink it and go to sleep peacefully, or I blow your brains out right here, wake up my children with the gunshot, and tell my men to burn your body in the city incinerator. Tears streamed down the older man's face. He looked into Victor's eyes and saw no mercy, no hesitation, only the absolute void of a monster he had helped create. Shaking violently, Dominic reached out, picked up the glass, and brought it to his lips. He squeezed his eyes shut and swallowed the cognac. Victor stood back and watched. It took less than 3 minutes. Dominic's breathing grew labored, his hands clutched at his chest, and his eyes rolled back. A violent spasm shook his body, and then he slumped forward, lifeless, the Vivaldi record continuing to play its haunting strings. Victor holstered his weapon. He pulled his phone from his pocket and hit a speed dial. Declan, Victor said calmly. Come to the library. My uncle has suffered a tragic, fatal heart attack. Call Dr. Reed to sign the death certificate, and tell the capos. Tomorrow there will be a funeral, and then there will be a coronation. Sunlight, painfully bright and clear, filtered through the heavy cream-colored silk drapes of the master's suite. Chloe stirred, her face buried in pillows so soft they felt like literal clouds. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. She reached out blindly, expecting the freezing, drafty wall of the Halstead apartment. Instead, her hand met fine Egyptian cotton. The memories of the night before rushed back. The snow, the rusted bench, the terrifying, godlike return of Victor. She sat up with a gasp, her heart pounding. She was wearing one of Victor's oversized dress shirts, the crisp white fabric draped over her large, heavy breasts and cascading down her thick thighs. She looked wildly around the massive room, the children. They are in the nursery. Through those doors, a low, gravelly voice said. Chloe spun around. Victor was sitting in a velvet armchair in the corner of the room. He had changed into a dark gray bespoke suit, his tie perfectly knotted. He looked exhausted, shadows bruising the skin under his icy blue eyes, but the predatory aura around him was absolute. Chloe scrambled out of the bed, her bare feet hitting the heated hardwood floor. She didn't care about the cold distance between them. Maternal panic overrode everything. She sprinted toward the heavy double doors Victor had pointed to and threw them open. Inside a room painted in soft, warm pastels, Arthur and Lily were fast asleep in twin, custom-built mahogany beds. Rosa, the housekeeper, was sitting in a rocking chair nearby, reading a rosary. She looked up and offered Chloe a warm, reassuring smile, pressing a finger to her lips. Relief washed over Chloe so intensely her knees buckled. She clung to the doorframe, tears welling in her eyes. They were safe. They were warm. They weren't coughing. She quietly closed the nursery doors and turned back to Victor. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were tracking her every breath, taking in the way his dress shirt clung to her soft, wide curves. You didn't sleep, Chloe observed, her voice raspy. I had family business to attend to, Victor replied smoothly, standing up and walking toward a silver breakfast cart that had been wheeled in earlier. He poured a cup of black coffee and handed it to her. Drink. You need your strength. Chloe took the porcelain cup, her hands shaking slightly. Victor, about what I said last night. About your father. My father didn't threaten you, Chloe, Victor said, his tone cutting through the quiet room like a blade. Chloe froze, the coffee sloshing over the rim of the cup onto her knuckles. But the ring, the man who came to the apartment, was sent by my Uncle Dominic, Victor finished for her. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the scent of bergamot and a faint trace of something metallic and dark clinging to him. Dominic was stealing from the syndicate. You accidentally found his ledgers in my safe. He panicked. He drove you into the snow to protect his own greed. Chloe's mind spun. 5 years of terror, 5 years of hiding her baby, starving herself, enduring the cruel mockery of the world, all because of one man's greed. Oh my God, she whispered, a sob tearing from her throat. Dominic. But he was always so kind to me. He brought me pastries from Little Italy. He was a rat, Victor corrected coldly, and a rat will smile at you while chewing through your floorboards. What are you going to do? She asked, terrified of the answer, yet a dark, vindictive part of her soul, a part that had watched her children freeze, wanted blood. Nothing, Victor said, reaching out to gently trace the soft, full curve of her jawline. Uncle Dominic passed away a few hours ago. A sudden, massive heart attack in the library. Tragic. The family's in mourning. Chloe stared at him. She understood exactly what he was saying. Victor had killed his own blood to avenge her. The sheer magnitude of his dark devotion terrified her, but as his thumb stroked her cheek, she couldn't deny the bone-deep, intoxicating feeling of being utterly, violently protected. "I looked for you," Victor whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. The icy mafia boss facade fractured, revealing the desperate, broken man beneath. He dropped the coffee cup from her hand onto the floor and wrapped his arms around her heavy waist, pulling her flesh against his chest. "I tore the city apart. I thought you realized I was a monster and ran. I thought you hated me." "I never hated you," Chloe cried, burying her face in his neck, wrapping her thick arms around his broad shoulders. "I loved you so much it physically hurt. But I had to protect the babies. I had to." "You did," Victor murmured fiercely, kissing the crown of her head, his hands sliding down to cup her heavy, wide hips. He pulled her tighter, relishing the soft, yielding weight of her body against his hard angles. "You won the war, Mia Bella. You kept my heirs alive. You kept my heart alive, but the running is over." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The possessiveness in his gaze was absolute. "You are going to marry me," Victor commanded, a dark, unbreakable vow. Not a quiet ceremony, a coronation. The entire syndicate, every capo, every boss from New York to Vegas will see you. They will look at you, they will look at my children, and they will know that you are the undisputed queen of this city, and if anyone so much as looks at you with disrespect, I will take their eyes. Chloe shivered, but she didn't pull away. She had survived the freezing dark. Now she was ready to rule it. 6 weeks had passed since the brutal winter night that resurrected the Romano Empire. The biting Orlando cold had slightly surrendered to the very early, damp whispers of spring, but inside the legendary Gold Coast ballroom of the Drake Hotel, the atmosphere was thick with an icy, dangerous tension. Victor had bought out the entire historic hotel for the weekend, turning the iconic Magnificent Mile landmark into a heavily fortified fortress. Over 200 armed men in bespoke suits secured the perimeter, lining the opulent carpeted hallways and standing like stone gargoyles at the entrances. Inside the grand ballroom, beneath the massive glittering crystal chandeliers and frescoed ceilings, the absolute elite of the American underworld had gathered. The heads of the Falcone family from New York were there, whispering in hushed tones with the bosses of the Moretti Syndicate from Las Vegas. Officially, the engraved gold leaf invitations had billed the evening as a gala to celebrate the christening of the new Romano heirs. But there was not a single capo, lieutenant, or politician in the room who did not understand the true nature of this gathering. This was Victor Romano solidifying his dictatorial control over the national syndicate following the sudden, highly suspicious heart attack of his Uncle Dominic. More importantly, it was the official introduction of the woman who miraculously held the leash of the most feared monster in Orlando. Standing near the base of the grand marble staircase, Victor nursed a snifter of 20-year-old Pappy Van Winkle bourbon. He was clad in a custom midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo that accentuated the broad, lethal lines of his physique. Beside him, Declan Murphy and Thomas Sterling, the syndicate's chief legal counsel, were quietly managing the endless flow of lieutenants stepping forward to pay their respects and quietly hand over thick envelopes of tribute. Upstairs, in the sprawling presidential suite, Chloe stood before a massive gilded mirror. Her breath caught in her throat. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, yet entirely herself. For 5 years she had tried to shrink, to make herself invisible, to hide beneath cheap baggy layers of faded fleece and shame. She had let the world and cruel men like Paul Abernathy dictate how she felt about her own flesh. But tonight, there was no hiding. She was a large, fat woman, and she was stepping into the light as a queen. She wore a custom-designed, off-the-shoulder gown crafted from heavy blood-red velvet, a masterpiece commissioned privately from a secluded atelier on Oak Street. The dress was a triumph of structure and drape. The bodice lifted and showcased the magnificent, heavy swell of her large breasts, while the thick velvet flowed down, unapologetically hugging the wide, lush curves of her hips and the thick expanse of her thighs. It was a gown designed not to conceal her bulk, but to weaponize it, turning her soft, heavy figure into a statement of absolute, unmovable power. Around her neck rested the legendary Romano family diamonds, stones so cold and brilliant they seemed to capture the light of the entire room. They had belonged to Victor's grandmother, locked in a vault for decades, and the weight of them against her collarbones was a physical reminder of her new reality. Her blonde hair was swept up in an intricate classic chignon by the city's top stylist, and her lips were painted a dark, dangerous crimson. Rosa, the housekeeper, stood behind her, tears welling in her kind eyes as she smoothed the long train of the velvet gown. "You are ready, Signora," she whispered. "You look like a goddess." "I look like a mother who survived," Chloe murmured, her voice steadying. She turned away from the mirror. In the adjoining room, the twins, Arthur and Lily, were dressed in immaculate miniature formal wear, their bright blue eyes wide and curious as they held the hands of two trusted nannies. Chloe took a deep breath, the heavy velvet of her bodice tightening over her chest. It was time, Down in the ballroom, the string quartet playing softly in the corner abruptly ceased their music. The heavy carved mahogany doors at the top of the grand staircase groaned open. A profound, suffocating silence immediately fell over the room. 300 hardened criminals, corrupt politicians, and wealthy socialites turned their faces upward, the clinking of crystal glasses stopping mid-air. Chloe stepped out onto the landing. A collective, silent shock rippled through the old guard of the mafia. They had expected a waif. They had expected a traditional, silent, thin trophy wife who would stand meekly in Victor's terrifying shadow. Instead, they were met with a powerhouse. Chloe stood at the top of the stairs, her large, lush frame dominating the space, the blood-red velvet and blinding diamonds making her look like a woman who had walked through hellfire and emerged wearing its flames as a crown. She did not shrink under their stares. She kept her chin high, her wide shoulders thrown back, radiating the fierce protective energy of a matriarch who had starved so her children could eat. Victor did not wait for her at the bottom of the stairs. He handed his bourbon to Declan and began to ascend, his eyes locked exclusively on Chloe. His gaze was filled with such a ravenous public worship that it sent a shiver down the spine of every man watching. He reached the landing, taking her soft, trembling hand in his large, calloused one, and brought her knuckles to his lips. His icy blue eyes snapped toward the crowd, silently daring a single soul in the room to show even a flicker of disrespect. Behind Chloe, the nannies stepped forward, presenting Arthur and Lily. A murmur tore through the crowd as the men saw the undeniable piercing blue Romano eyes looking back at them from the 4-year-old boy. Victor placed a firm, protective hand on the small of Chloe's wide back, guiding her to the very edge of the marble landing. He looked down at his empire, my friends, my family. Victor's baritone voice boomed effortlessly through the cavernous ballroom, vibrating with authority. For 5 long years, there was a shadow over my house, a shadow placed there by traitors, cowards, and parasites who believed they could steal from this family and threaten what is mine. He let the words hang heavily in the air. Every capo knew exactly who he was talking about. The recent, bloody purges of Dominic's loyalists had painted the streets red. But tonight, the shadows eradicated, Victor continued, his grip tightening securely on the heavy curve of Chloe's waist, anchoring her to him. The old ways that drove my family into the dark are dead. I present to you the future, my wife, Chloe Romano, the undisputed mother of the Orlando Syndicate, and my blood, Arthur and Lily Romano. Victor reached out, taking a fresh glass of champagne from a waiter who had hurried up the steps. He raised the crystal flute high. His eyes swept the room, cold and absolute. You will look at her, and you will know that she is the queen of this city. Her word is my word. Her enemies are dead men walking to the queen. Below them, there was not a fraction of a second of hesitation. 300 men and women raised their glasses in perfect, terrified, and awestruck unison. To the Queen! The unified shout exploded through the Gold Coast ballroom, echoing off the gold leaf ceilings and rattling the crystal chandeliers. As the crowd broke into thunderous applause and the highest-ranking capos began to form a line at the base of the stairs to physically kiss her ring, Chloe looked up at the towering man beside her. Victor was a ruthless killer. He was a monster who ruled the city's darkest corners. But as he looked down at her, his icy eyes entirely soft with a profound, violent, and unyielding love, the last of the freezing cold finally left her bones. She had traded a rusted park bench for a velvet cage, but as the underworld bowed at her feet, she realized it wasn't a cage at all. It was a throne, and the monster standing beside her belonged entirely to her. What a breathtaking journey. From freezing on a rusted park bench to being crowned the undisputed queen of the Orlando Syndicate, Chloe proved that a mother's fierce love and unyielding resilience can conquer even the darkest of empires. Victor literally burned his own family to the ground to protect her, proving that the most ruthless monsters will bow to the women they love. But what did you think of that shocking twist? Did Uncle Dominic get the brutal karma he deserved? Let us know in the comments below. If you love this intense, full-length dark mafia romance of betrayal, survival, and ultimate revenge, please hit that like button to support the channel. Share this incredible story with your friends who love fiercely protective alpha males and unapologetically strong queens. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next gripping audio drama.